A bitter wind howled over the barren fields as the last of the villagers stumbled through the snow, their skins stretched thin from weeks without bread. Crows gathered on the roof of the burned chapel, their cries echoing over the broken fences. In the ruins, a girl knelt beside her mother's frozen body. Her lips cracked, hands raw from clawing at the dry earth to bury what she could not lift. Smoke rose from the valley below, where the Duke's army camped, tents bristling with pikes and banners painted with a black serpent swallowing its tail. The soldiers came at dawn, boots crunching over frost, iron blades knocking open doors that hung on rotting hinges. Some of the old men tried to hide in the lofts, but their coughs betrayed them. When they dragged the girl from the ashes of her cottage, she did not fight. She had no strength to scream when they tied her wrists with frayed rope. Her breath showed in clouds as they marched her past the village well, where dirty water froze in the bucket, the rope stiff with ice. They shoved her with a spear when she stumbled, but she barely felt the bruise rising on her hip. She did not yet know she would never see her name written again, never speak it aloud, without risk of losing her tongue. To the men in mail and fur, she was only a piece of spoiled meat, gathered like firewood for their master's hearth. They brought her to the Duke's keep at dusk. The stone walls loomed above the white drifts like the spine of some sleeping beast. Inside the gates, the yard reeked of dung and old blood, where butchered pigs hung in rows from black iron hooks. Torches hissed as snow melted around them, casting sickly orange light on piles of soiled straw. The girl's eyes burned from the stench as she was shoved through an arched door into a hall where a great fire spit and cracked. The warmth, too, far away to touch. At the head of the hall, the Duke sat slouched on a carved chair, furs pooled at his boots. He was a barrel of flesh, with yellow eyes sunk deep as pits. Beside him, the seneschal leaned close, a stooped man draped in an oily wool robe, breath sour with boiled onions. She thought they would question her about the village, who fled, who hid, who stole grain. Instead, the seneschal stepped down from the dais, grabbed her chin, and turned her head toward the flickering light. His cold fingers pressed her cheeks, peeling open her eyelids like a horse's mouth. His voice rose in a whisper that cracked like dry reeds. He told the Duke to look closer, the eyes, the curve of the cheek, the pale lash of the brow. She looked just enough like the lost child, the dead girl who had lain beneath the silk-draped bier last spring while the priests mumbled that the angel of pestilence had stolen her soul as punishment for her mother's pride. No one asked if she was hungry. No one asked her name. They stripped the lice-riddled blanket from her shoulders and thrust a flask of rank rosewater under her nose. She gagged at the sweetness turned rancid, but held still as they poured it over her matted hair, tangled with ash and straw. Her shift, torn and filthy, fell to the floor. Maids, with red-chapped hands, scraped at her skin with rough cloths dipped in cold water, tinged pink with old wine. They clucked and muttered about peasant filth, about sin that soaked the flesh so deep not even holy water could cleanse it. They scraped until the skin on her neck burned raw, but the grit in the creases of her elbows remained. A monk watched from a corner, his nose buried in a thin leather book, lips moving as he read aloud a prayer for purity. He did not look at her face but at the shadows behind her, as if the spirit of the real princess waited there to slip back into this breathing shell. When the maids finished, they smeared tallow along her scalp to suffocate fleas, then wrapped her in a velvet gown that smelled of lavender turned moldy. The sleeves dragged on the rush-covered floor, wet at the hems from years of spilled broth and chamber pot leaks. They forced her feet into kidskin slippers, stiff with dried sweat. When she was presented again before the Duke, she felt the weight of dead eyes on her. He reached for her chin but stopped short, as though touching her would confirm some blasphemy he dared not name. The seneschal spoke for him. This was his daughter returned, a sign from the heavens that the pestilence could be driven out if her spirit was restored to the house. Servants crossed themselves. A nurse whispered to another that perhaps the child had been hidden away to save her from the plague. Another spat on the rushes and swore the real princess's ghost would come at midnight to drag this impostor into the pit where they buried the sick. They gave her a new bed in a tower chamber that smelled of damp stone and stale incense. The mattress sagged in the middle where the body of the lost girl had once lain, sweating out fever, while the priests beat their chests below. Rats scratched at the edges of the cold hearth. A single candle guttered in a cracked iron holder. When she lay down, the lice from the old blankets found her at once, burrowing under the raw edges of her scalp where the tallow had turned sour. She stared at the beam above her head, where some child's name had been scratched with a nail. A name, so worn by time and soot, she could not read it. Voices drifted from the corridor, where the old nurse muttered to the guards about the duke's grief, how he had locked himself in the chapel for 3 days beside the dead child's corpse, until the stench drove him out. They spoke of the princess's vanity, how she bathed in rosewater once a season, powdered her skin with crushed pearls, painted her cheeks with lead paste that crusted in the sores beneath her jaw. They said she slept in silks, never washed, lest they lose their heavenly sheen. When she fell ill, no salve or prayer could cleanse her from within. Now they said this peasant would pay her penance in flesh. Before dawn, the seneschal returned to her chamber, candle in hand, eyes gleaming with some secret delight. He told her she must not speak unless spoken to, must not ask for food except at dusk, must never look the duke directly in the face. Her tongue, he said, could be a serpent if she dared twist it wrong. He brought a comb carved from bone, snapped 2 teeth from its spine, and dragged it through what hair remained around her tender scalp. She bit her lip to keep from crying out when it snagged. Blood beaded at her temple, swallowed back into the damp linen collar of the dead girl's dress. When the seneschal left, he locked the door behind him with a heavy bolt. Through the thin glass of the window slit, she could see the courtyard below, where men-at-arms huddled around barrels of burning pitch. Snow drifted past the arrow slits like ash from some hidden fire. In the chapel yard, dogs rooted in the dirt where fresh graves sank in the frost. Somewhere beneath that churned earth lay the bones of the one she now had to become. She pressed her cracked fingers to her lips to remember their warmth, to taste any scrap of herself not yet taken. In the silence, the tower breathed with her. Fleas hopped at her ankles. The linen at her throat rasped as she turned her head to the wall, where the damp bled through in dark veins. There would be no one to ask who she was before. No village that would claim her. The girl who buried her mother was already dead the moment her feet crossed the keep's threshold. The wind rattled the shutter, as if the lost princess herself knocked to come home and finish what pestilence began. She curled on the mattress in the shallow impression left by someone who once slept believing herself untouchable behind stone walls and silk curtains. Outside, the crows waited in the chapel, rafters, black eyes glittering against the frozen stars. The candle burned low in the tower chamber as her eyes cracked open to the scrape of the iron latch. A servant boy no older than she had once been shuffled in, arms wrapped tight around a bundle of soiled linen. He did not speak, only nodded at the basket by the door, then bent to collect her stained bedding, careful not to meet her eyes. The cold bit through the thin chemise she wore under the dead girl's heavy gown. The stale scent of last night's stew clung to her fingers where she'd licked the drips from the wooden bowl left outside her door. She forced her feet into the slippers, stiff with frost, fighting the shiver that rattled her teeth. They led her through corridors heavy with the sour odor of sweat trapped under furs and velvet. Tall windows leaked drafts sharp enough to make her eyes water. The walls wept green damp that crept into tapestries so old the threads hung loose like moss. She passed a row of squires beating dust from a faded carpet with sticks, their faces hidden by kerchiefs, to guard against the filth that rose in clouds thick enough to choke. A monk crossed himself when she passed, whispering a quick prayer she could not hear over the thud of sticks against clothed up. In the great hall, tables dripped, with last night's bones and crusts left for the dogs that snapped at each other underfoot. The stone floor was slick with spilled ale and grease from the spit where pigs turned slow and black over smoldering embers. She was pushed to a low stool near the hearth, where an old nurse clucked her tongue and thrust a cracked bowl into her hands. The porridge inside was thin as ditch water, gray lumps drifting like drowned worms. She ate because she must. Around her, maids scrubbed wooden trenchers with handfuls of rushes pulled fresh from the riverbank. Their hands were raw with chilblains, nails broken to the quick. A girl beside her wiped her mouth with the back of her wrist and leaned in close, enough for the captive to smell the sour milk on her breath. She whispered about the lady of the house, how she slept in the same shift for weeks, refusing to let the laundress touch her silks for fear the washing would strip them of good fortune. When the bowl was empty, the nurse slapped her shoulder, urging her to stand. They pressed a battered comb into her hand and guided her to a bench beside the fire, where other girls sat, heads bent to their own sores and split ends. She dragged the comb through the tufts of hair, growing stubborn over the raw lines of her shaved scalp. Each pull brought tears she did not dare let fall. A lice comb lay in a bowl of sour wine nearby. She watched a maid wring out stained kerchiefs in the same wine, then dabbed the sticky liquid behind her ears, where fresh bites bloomed red. A bell tolled far above in the chapel tower. The nurse barked orders. Girls scattered to carry fresh rushes. To the solar ashes, to the kitchen, buckets of gray water, to the yard where pigs rooted in the mud. She was taken instead to the Duchess's chamber, its air heavy with the stink of sweat and rotting lavender sachets, crushed under silk pillows. The Duchess lay half awake, skin like parchment dotted with yellowed sores at the hairline. A maid lifted the lady's arm to swab the damp beneath, dabbing with linen so thin it fell apart in their hands. The captive stood still as a statue, while the maid tied fresh ribbons at her throat. The Duchess's gaze drifted over her, and then away, unfocused, as though staring through smoke. Her lips moved around a prayer to the Virgin, though no priest dared remind her how many times her confessor found her soiled bedding unwashed for months. Crawling with mites, she helped turn the lady's pillows, forced to breathe in the sour warmth trapped beneath. A servant brushed crumbs from the coverlet into a chamber pot already buzzing with flies. At night, she was told, rats skittered along the canopy beams, dropping pellets that no one swept away until they fell into the Duchess's open mouth. The maid hissed that she must watch for lice at the base of the lady's neck and pluck them out if they crawled into view. She obeyed, fingers trembling each time she pinched a tiny squirming body and dropped it into a cracked cup of stale vinegar that barely drowned them. In the passage outside, she caught glimpses of other captives, and servants shuffling along with lowered heads. Some bore the marks of lashings, hidden beneath collars and sleeves. A young boy missing an ear carried a pail of gray water that sloshed with the stench of chamber pots emptied only when the stink choked the upper floors. She asked him his name in a whisper, when no guard watched. He glanced at her with hollow eyes but only shook his head. Names were dangerous in these walls, where tongues were coins traded for favor or threat. Each dusk, she was brought before the steward to recite prayers she did not understand. A monk prodded her shoulders with the blunt end of a quill if her voice cracked. He murmured that even the dead princess had sometimes spoken too plainly for a girl so pure, that her words had called down pestilence when she refused to wear the talisman sewn with pig's blood in secret pouches beneath her chemise. He handed the captive such a pouch, reeking of old salt and mold, and ordered her to pin it near her heart. She hid it under the folds of the gown's stiff bodice, its scratchy stitches scraping her ribs raw as she breathed. At night she was left alone in the tower again, though the door never stayed fully shut. The guards peered in to check she did not weep too loudly or scratch the walls again with pins hidden under the mattress. One dusk, she found a crumb of black bread pushed under her door. She devoured it and wondered who risked such mercy. When she crept to the window slit, she caught sight of the kitchen boy crouched below. A finger pressed to his lips before he vanished behind the midden heap. Days passed in the slow rot of stale air and whispers. When she bled for the first time, since the snows came, the nurse slapped her cheek for soiling the sheets that no one would scrub clean until the stain spread like rust. They pressed a linen rag between her thighs and tied it with coarse twine that scraped her skin raw. There was no soap, only cold water in a cracked basin where fleas drowned faster than the filth would rinse away. The stink of old blood clung to her thighs. She learned to walk with her knees tight to keep the rag in place. The other girls did the same, though they said nothing. The guards laughed behind closed doors about the stink of women's beds. They mocked the countess who dabbed perfume at her wrists instead of washing her hands after wiping herself, leaving fingerprints of musk on every latch she touched. When the wind turned warm, the yard below filled with barrels of rainwater grown slick with scum. Servants fought over the first pails to rinse sweat from their necks, while the noblewomen sent maids to fetch the same water to splash once on their cheeks, before drying it with scraps of rabbit fur. A rumor spread through the hall that the Duchess' daughter kept a jar of crushed roses to mask the stink of her bedding, though no maid dared lift her skirts to air the sores that festered there. The captive listened to each secret, storing them like pebbles beneath her tongue. She learned the rhythm of footsteps in the corridor, how the heavy boots of guards differed from the soft shuffle of the old nurse, the hollow tap of the monk's cane. She learned when to bow her head, when to hold her breath, as lice crawled behind her ears during morning prayers. She did not speak unless told, did not ask when the sores at her scalp wept yellow pus onto the stiff collar of the princess's gown. When she slept, she dreamed of a river where clean water ran so clear she could see her mother's face smiling beneath the surface. She always woke before she touched it. Each dusk, the seneschal tested her voice, forcing her to mimic the soft lilt of the dead girl's laugh, the tilt of her chin when addressing her father. He hissed that she must be perfect, or they would dig a fresh pit beside the chapel wall and toss her in before the worms found her veins. She bowed lower each time, until her neck ached from the weight of silence. She watched the noble ladies in the high seats, painted faces cracking under powder, made from ground bones and lead scraped from cellar barrels. They never bathed more than once a season, terrified that warm water would open their pores and invite demons through the skin. Instead they rubbed rose oil into the folds of their armpits and knees, sealing filth beneath silk and fur that never touched soap. She saw their servants scrape flakes of black sweat from collars stiff as bark. At feasts they sat straight-backed in gowns that smelled of stale wine and old breath, eyes darting past her like she was smoke. When she returned to her tower at night, the cold rushes crackled under her feet. She folded her hands beneath the lice-infested blanket, pressed her lips to her knuckles, and whispered the only name she dared keep hidden. No one answered in the darkness, but the fleas that fed where the bruises bloomed on her skin. Her stomach growled, and the wind rattled the shutter, as though asking if she still remembered the face of the mother she buried in snow. She did, but she no longer knew if that girl, barefoot in a ruin, had ever truly lived, or if she too was a ghost, trapped beneath velvet and stale rosewater. The spring storms came sudden and fierce, rattling shutters and flooding the narrow lanes, where servants dumped waste each dawn. She woke to the hammer of rain on the tower roof and the scrape of boots outside her door. A guard shoved her awake, with the blunt end of his spear, motioning for her to rise before the monk arrived, to find her still wrapped in the lice-infested blanket. She stumbled into the hall, eyes half open, feet numb against the wet stones that seeped chill through her slippers. The corridor stank worse than before, the rushes slick with mildew where rain dripped from cracks in the ceiling. A kitchen girl lay curled in a corner, hair matted with vomit. No one stopped to help her. In the chapel, they forced her to kneel for hours on cold flagstones slick with wax drippings. The priest droned on about pestilence and sin while a steward paced behind her. tapping the rod against his palm each time she shifted her weight to ease the burn in her knees. They said the storm was God's voice, angry at a house that failed to keep the memory of the lost princess pure. The monk leaned close enough for his sour breath to sting her nostrils. He accused her of harboring unclean thoughts that drew sickness into these walls. She bowed deeper, hands pressed together, so tightly the skin split at her knuckles. He hissed that the old duchess coughed blood at dawn, that the castle physician blamed it on poisoned air, a punishment for false saints kept alive in stolen skin. She tried to listen without listening. Each word burrowed under her ribs like a worm gnawing the heart hollow. In the passages beyond the chapel door, servants whispered that rats gnawed the grain stores. Barrels split open with green mold, bread went stale in hours. Those who could still eat forced it down with vinegar to keep the rot from clawing their bellies raw. Some blamed her. They spat behind her back that she brought famine, just as she had brought winter when she arrived shivering and half-starved from the field where the soldiers found her. She never spoke to defend herself. Words were traps. She learned that well. The storm worsened. Water ran down the tower stairs, pooling ankle-deep in her cell. They gave her no straw this time. She sat against the wall, knees tucked under her chin, watching worms float on the surface of the puddle where her blanket soaked up filth and lice fled to the dry edge near her neck. The guard who once slipped her a crust now refused to meet her eyes. He whispered a fast prayer before locking her in each dusk. She caught only fragments: plague, penance, sacrifice. He was afraid now, like the rest. When dawn broke, they dragged her out again. In the courtyard, peasants knelt in mud before the steward, who read accusations from a damp scrap of parchment. 2 boys, brothers, they said, were tied to a post for stealing spoiled meat from the kitchen scraps. The steward ordered lashes, but told her to stand near, to watch how a thief's sin was drawn out, drop by drop. Each strike splattered the mud darker. She stared at her feet, feeling the sting as though the whip found her own skin. The boys didn't cry out until the last blow. She wanted to close her eyes, but did not dare. When it ended, the monk turned to her and asked if she would pray for their souls. She nodded, mouth dry. He sneered that she must do better, that the real princess had wept at suffering, had begged her father to spare the wretched. Did she not remember? Her silence was an insult to the dead. That night they left her without food, saying fasting would cleanse the corruption that festered in her mind. She curled on the stone, belly gnawing itself hollow. In dreams, she saw herself scraping mud from the courtyard, licking the whip's blood from her own palms. The storm roared through broken panes, rattling doors and sweeping the stench of damp straw up the tower. She wondered if the real princess had ever smelled this rot, or if her chamber had always been perfumed and warm. She did not know any more where the dead girl ended and she began. Days bled into one another. The old duchess slipped in and out of fever. When the steward spoke of the family's ruin, he stared straight at her, as though to remind her that her face was the thread tying this house to God's mercy. The monk claimed she must prove herself worthy, that a sign of purity must be shown before Easter. They cut a lock of her hair and burned it in the chapel brazier, mumbling that if the smoke rose white, she was clean. The smoke curled black, thick as tar. He declared penance must follow. The guards dragged her to the courtyard again, barefoot in sleet that turned her toes blue. She knelt in the slurry of dung and melted snow while villagers were summoned to watch. The monk draped a sackcloth over her shoulders and pressed ashes to her brow. He chanted that the spirit of the dead girl must be pleased. She did not move, as cold seeped into her bones until they clacked together under her skin. When they pulled her upright, her knees buckled. A guard struck her cheek with the back of his hand to keep her awake. He muttered about her hair, how the soft curls that once made the duke weep now clung to her skull in patches crusted with sores. The resemblance was fading. She heard him say it through the ringing in her ears. Asterisk, the likeness dies. The use dies with it. Asterisk, he spat on the ground beside her bare foot and turned away. That night, the nurse brought her a bowl of thin broth and hissed for her to eat quickly. If you die too soon, the house dies with you, she muttered before snatching the bowl away, half-empty. In the dark, her mind rattled through half-memories that no longer belonged to her alone. She saw her mother's hands, but also the Duchess's cough, the princess's painted lips in the portraits that hung above the hearth. She touched her face, fingers tracing the sore at her temple where lice burrowed deep. Did they see the princess there, or only a scabbed ghost? When the monk found her scratching too deep, he slapped her wrist and forced a splintered comb into her hand, making her tear the knots until blood speckled her chemise. One dusk, she heard the boy's voice again. The guard who once brought her bread now pressed his lips to the crack in the door and whispered that rats in the kitchen had torn through the last sacks of grain. He said the steward planned to sell her to a monastery before the famine took the house. Let the monks keep the lie alive behind cold walls, where no one would see the sores or smell the filth that clung to her skin. He begged her to pray for him before the steward caught him speaking treason. She pressed her palm to the door in answer. He was gone before the hinges creaked in the hall. The maids scrubbed rushes soaked with urine and wine, while dogs fought over bones by the hearth. She stood unnoticed, a shadow in borrowed skin. She thought of fleeing, of slipping into the storm and burying her name beneath the same snow that buried her mother. But where would she run? The monk's threats wrapped around her throat. The steward's sneer echoed in her skull. She belonged to the likeness now, a ghost wearing flesh too thin to keep the worms out. They summoned her before dawn. The monk declared a final test. He spoke of trials for witches and heretics, water that washed away lies, fire that burned deceit clean. She must kneel by the river that cut through the forest beyond the castle walls. If she sank, the spirit would take her, prove her innocence. If she floated, she was filth, and they would drag her back to the stones to confess and beg forgiveness for poisoning the house with plague. She stared past him, past the flickering torchlight that carved shadows into faces she barely recognized. The likeness flickered to a wisp of candle smoke. She felt it leaving her skin, taking her name with it, as they dragged her down the narrow stairs to the river. She heard the steward say they would find another if she failed, another girl with the same wide eyes, the same soft mouth that could be painted with memory until truth bled away. In her heart, she wondered if the river would remember her real face when it closed over her head. She prayed it would. When the river's edge cut into her ankles, she felt the chill bite bone. They had bound her wrists with coarse rope that burned her raw skin each time she stumbled. The monks' chanting drifted down from the slope where the steward and guards watched, their torches guttering in the dawn wind. Mud sucked at her feet, each step a pull toward something deeper, darker. She did not look back when the rope jerked her forward. She did not cry out when her knees gave way and she dropped into the freezing current that carried hay, scraps, and dead leaves downstream toward the mill. She wondered if the real princess had ever stepped into water that smelled of dung and rotting rushes. She doubted it. They forced her to stand in the shallows while the monk recited words meant to cleanse sin or drag it into the open for all to see. His voice cracked when the wind cut through his throat. He raised a hand and gave the signal. The steward lifted the end of the rope, tied around her wrists, and dragged her farther out, until the river swallowed her waist. She gasped when the cold clutched her belly, but the sound was eaten by the rush of water and the muttered prayers behind her. Her feet lost the gravel bed. She floated for a heartbeat, then the tug at her arms yanked her under. The river did not roar. It smothered. It pressed mud and silt against her mouth until she opened her lips, and the filth found its way in. Her eyes stung, her ears filled with the dull beat of her heart. She did not fight. For a moment, she believed she might stay beneath forever, that her breath would not rebel and force her up to prove her guilt. But her body betrayed her. Her lungs clawed for air. Her head broke the surface. She vomited brown water into the current, blinking at the torchlight that flickered like stars on the banks. The steward spat at the mud. The monk crossed himself. She had floated. She had failed. They dragged her back onto the bank, water spilling from her chemise in streams that carved lines through the frost. The steward struck her across the cheek, muttering that she was filth, that clung too tight to the bones she did not own. The guards shoved her forward up the slope, her bare feet slipping on wet grass. When she fell, the monk pressed the rod to the back of her neck, forcing her forehead to the dirt. He hissed that she would face the pyre if her confession displeased them. He swore the fire would burn her clean if the river would not wash her sins away. They locked her in a cellar, beneath the kitchen while they prepared. The door shut out, the voices overhead, but not the smell of stale onions and rat droppings. She curled in the straw, too tired to shiver, her hair stiff with river mud. She thought of her mother's arms but could not summon the shape of her face. The likeness had swallowed her real memory whole. Somewhere above, a maid dropped a pot and cursed when the broth splattered her feet. Life went on around her as though she had never been more than a shadow. A rumor passed from mouth to mouth, until no one cared to ask where she'd come from. At dusk, they brought her out under torchlight again. The courtyard stank of wet wood and smoke. The villagers crowded close, breath misting in the cold. A few crossed themselves, more stared, as if hoping to see the princess appear through the rags clinging to her shoulders. The monk read aloud, a list of sins that grew with every word. He claimed she had poisoned the steward's household, that her filthy thoughts had conjured plague from the well. He named her a liar, a vessel for envy, a witch who lured the living into worship of the dead. She kept her head down, mouth shut. No word she gave them could change what they had already written. The pyre was stacked with damp straw that hissed when the first torch touched it. Smoke curled thick and low, choking the air so her eyes watered. She remembered standing once by the kitchen hearth when a stray ember caught her sleeve. A maid had slapped the flame out, scolding her for carelessness. Now no hand came to rescue her. She wondered if she would feel the heat before her skin cracked, or if the smoke would steal her breath first. The guards pressed her closer. She heard a voice, thin and cracked. The guard who once brought her bread, muttering a prayer he could not finish. Then the wind shifted. The flame sputtered. A cough rippled through the crowd. A cry rose when a rider thundered through the gate. Mud sprang from the horse's hooves. The steward stepped back as the rider threw a parchment at his feet. A seal glistened red under torchlight. The monk bent to read, his lips moving in disbelief. The rumor spread faster than the fire ever could. A new princess had been found alive in a distant convent, hidden away during the war that took the old duke's life. A real heir, with the same birthmark behind her ear that old nurses swore proved her royal blood. The likeness was no longer needed. The monk turned to her, eyes hollow under the cowl. He told the guards to take her away, not to free her, never that, but to remove her filth from the courtyard before the villagers saw how quickly the lie fell apart. The steward spat in the straw, ordering them to lock her in the old tower until dawn. After that, the riders would decide whether she was worth keeping alive or worth discarding, where no record would stain the family's new claim. They shoved her into the tower's base, a round cell with walls damp and slick where rain leaked through the stones. No fire, no blanket, just the cold and the stink of old rushes and rat droppings. She sat against the wall, wrists raw from the rope, head buzzing with the taste of ash and river mud. She understood then that no pyre would come for her. Not today, not in the courtyard where faces might remember her shape. Her death would come quiet, under stone. A slip of moldy bread maybe, or a cup of water turned sour. A monk's soft prayer no one would write down. The same end for countless others, slaves, captives, concubines who looked too much like someone worth mourning. Outside, the wind rattled the tower slit. She heard the guards laughing in the yard, boasting that the steward would fetch a good price for her bones if the monastery didn't want her. She pressed her hand to the stone. It was colder than the river. She imagined the plague pits outside the walls, where the nameless were thrown in heaps when fever took whole villages. She saw herself there, faceless, voiceless, unmarked by any cross. The likeness had not saved her, only prolonged the silence that waited for her all along. As dawn bled gray through the crack in the tower slit, she closed her eyes and let the shiver settle in her chest. No prayers came to her lips, no memories of the mother who gave her a name before hunger took it back. She did not wish for freedom. She did not wish for warmth. She only wished the next girl who bore a stolen face might run before the likeness found her, might slip into the river on her own feet, unbound, might leave no ghost behind for monks to burn clean. The wind carried the echo of hooves in the yard, new riders bringing new truths to bury the old ones. She leaned her head against the stone and let the sound drift away. In the end, there would be no word carved for her, no chant in the chapel, no soft mouth whispering her name in the dark. Just the cold and the hush of history swallowing the likeness whole.